This penultimate panel is the threats from authoritarianism and corruption and kleptocracy. And moderating this is a longtime friend and one of the leading activists and advocates on this issue, Charles Davidson. Charles, over to you.
All right, thank you, David, and thank you, David and Nino and Evelyn for inviting me. And this has been an extraordinary conference, I think. And as far as conferences go, one might say it's timely, which isn't always the case. Before we start, and before I introduce everyone, I'd just like to say, in relation to the previous panel, which was so moving, in terms of our topic, Vladimir Kara-Murza used to repeatedly say in his op-eds in the Washington Post, and in just about every event where I heard him speak, when asked, what can the West do to help Russia, he would reply, stop enabling the corruption. We heard him say that many, many times. So anyway, as David said, I'm Charles Davidson. We have a wonderful panel here coming at the subject from all sorts of different directions, including a criminologist, a tenured criminologist. So he can, of course, say what he really thinks.
Not Kremlinology, criminology.
Yes, not Kremlinology.
Although there are many criminals in the Kremlin too.
Criminology, yes. So Besiki Kutateladze, is that close?
Excellent.
The last name? Okay, is with us. We have Marta Ruda from ANTAC, arguably the leading anti-corruption NGO of the Maidan generation in Ukraine. And on your programs, of course, it says Daria Kalenyuk. We merely need to imagine that Marta is Daria. To my right, then, we have Ben Judah, who published, his first book was published about Russia, Fragile Empire, when he was 23 years old. So he's a Russia guy, and then he's also very much an anti-kleptocracy corruption guy, as many of you may know from his writings. And he's a well-known journalist who has written in popular magazines too, so he's someone who plays all the keys of the piano. From Transparency International Georgia, we have Eka Gigauri, whom I've met at previous conferences here, and who really knows what's going on in Georgia. And of course, since she is from Transparency International, which I think we all know by reputation, the topic of this panel is somewhat appropriate to what she has been doing over the years. Now, but before we start also, the title of this panel, which mentions authoritarianism and corruption and kleptocracy, modern-day authoritarianism, when we look at it, all the current authoritarian regimes, I would argue, incorporate corruption and kleptocracies. There is no authoritarian regime that is not corrupt and kleptocratic. So, in fact, we're going to leave aside the issue of authoritarianism and just talk about corruption and kleptocracy. We're going to start, actually, with what might be considered an overture to the opera with our tenured criminologist, because I've always heard over the years from people, oh, you know, you can't do anything about this because you have this opaque offshore financial system, and you may catch one or two people, but you can't possibly roll it up. Well, criminology has something to say about that, and Besiki, please.
Sure, absolutely. So in criminology, and I don't want to be lecturing here because I do this for a living elsewhere, we believe in deterrence, very much like in the political science. We believe in both specific deterrence, which is to warn individuals not to commit new crimes, otherwise their punishment will be even harsher. And would you believe in general deterrence also, to send a message to others not to think twice about committing the crimes. So if it didn't exist in criminology, the criminal justice system would not have functioned. So for all the centuries, we have embraced this notion. But that's not a perfect notion. I personally also believe in incapacitation. And when it comes to the ideas of fighting corruption, fighting white-collar crimes, money laundering, I do believe in incapacitation approach also. We need to be realistic. While we believe in deterrence, we also need to be realistic that kleptocrats are very smart, extremely well-connected, and the idea of the kleptocracy is a very transnational, dynamic form of corruption. So the siloed approach will not work. We need the partnerships, both in the United States, within the Ukraine, Eastern Europe, but also international partnerships. But also the approaches that may be working today certainly will not work tomorrow, because people tend to reinvent themselves, especially when they're rich, when they're connected. And that is true about any good thief, any good criminal. Good criminal is a criminal who is one step ahead of law enforcement. And I think people who are corrupt and the benefits of the corruption are so vast for themselves and their families, they will find the ways around. That's why we need to invest into our law enforcement. And instead of maybe spending all our, I'm going to talk a lot about prosecution because that's what I do. I do in the United States, I'm involved in the prosecutorial reform very actively. So instead of spending all our resources on prosecuting low-level crimes, I think it's important that the law enforcement agencies learn how to prioritize bigger, more consequential cases with greater return for the public safety, for community health and well-being. So those things are important to consider.
Terrific. And we'll come back later to judicial issues specifically regarding Ukraine. But we just wanted to open with this, which is also a rather optimistic note. Now, our topic, Ukraine. So Marta is going to lead us into various issues concerning corruption, kleptocracy in Ukraine and the work of her organization, Antec.
Yeah, thank you very much. And as a Ukrainian, I'm very grateful for Georgia for hosting this conference and actually devoting it to Ukraine and for the slogan Slava Ukraini. And through this, I feel support and Ukrainians feel support of many Georgians. And actually, yes, I represent Anticorruption NGO, which for a decade actually has been advocating for effective anti-corruption institutions. And together with others, we were quite successful, I would say. We've created the whole system, parallel system of fighting top corruption, investigative body, prosecution body, and anti-corruption court. Because we understand, and actually I agree with Besiki, sorry, that you have to prioritize, and we as Antac, we understood that there is a proverb that fish is rotting from the head, so that's why you have to clear the head first, and then petty corruption will decrease for sure. And also judicial reform is another important sphere which we are advocating for cleansing and also quite successfully. And coming closer to the war, we were surprised actually by Vladimir Putin's speech on the 20th of February, where he mentioned all Ukrainian effective anti-corruption reform, including the way we chose judicial governance bodies. It means that democratic transformation, anti-corruption transformation of Ukraine was a really threat for Russia. And this was one of the reasons actually, as we see, for punishing us for going forward and going actually apart from authoritarianism and actually and also Putin's regime. And that's why we actually understand it also as a global threat and global issue, not only for Ukraine, because many countries, and including Georgia, are trying to go this path and path of democratization. And to my mind, as I see this tendency, first, Russia is creating internal conflict, so to say, in some territory and calling it like national one, like there is one in Georgia and also in Ukraine. We had 2014 war. And then if a country is still resisting it, still successful on the way to democratic transformation, there is no other chance actually to defeat it, only like through military aggression. And unfortunately, we cannot fight it back with another means other than arms. And that's why our anti-corruption organization recently, we actually after the start of the war, we put a lot of efforts on advocacy of enough arms to Ukraine to defeat the country, its people, but also actually democratic order and things which we were like fighting and building together with other partners and actually international donors, and where we were also in some trends like setters and example to other countries which also can follow this path. And if we will lose, it's not an option, like neither for us or for the world. That's why this is the only way forward, and this is actually one of our key messages and key aims of our organization. And
so can you just very briefly tell us how has the war affected the work of ANTAC and other anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine? Just very briefly, because in what ways have you had to switch gears, adapt? How is anti-corruption positioned now in the current situation?
Yeah, actually, I would say that the work of whole of our society, NGOs and anti-corruption bodies, they were quite similar, this tendency, because part of both our experts and workers and also prosecutors, they went to the military actually, and they went to defend our country. And also another part, we try to use our expertise in bringing the victory closer. For example, if you had good analysts who used to look for some like corrupted schemes, who knew how to use like foreign databases and so on, they used their skills to find people who have to be sanctioned. If like our communication experts, they use their skills, connections and knowledges to fight back actually in information war. Lawyers to international advocacy, we actually, together with other Ukrainian NGOs and mostly women, like only women, we created International Center for Ukrainian Victory in Warsaw. Few women who, like heads of the Ukrainian NGOs who fled together with small children especially, and it became quite important international advocacy like center, and also where we could cooperate, and very good example actually of cooperation of Ukrainian civil society. So we are fighting on this international advocacy field in order to bring sanctions, to bring more military support, to bring responsibility for war crimes, to develop new international mechanisms as well, because unfortunately some are not working.
Right, so you feel as though you're an integral part of the war effort, yes or no?
Yeah,
okay.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Eka, corruption, kleptocracy, Georgia's situation, if you could talk about that, please. And also, how does the Ukraine war affect Georgia's challenges with this issue?
Well, I would say that Georgia is in the unique situation here because for many years, Georgian anti-corruption reforms were like very popular. I would say we managed to eradicate corruption in several months even. And this is a good example how successful the government could be when there is a political will to fight corruption inside the country. And definitely we were in the position, and also these anti-corruption reforms, what was this for Georgia? At the same time, we wanted to show to the whole world that if the government is ready to build the independent institutions, fight the corruption so it can be successful, and it also can show to the neighboring countries like Russia that with this we can be resistant to the Russian influence and really show to the post-Soviet world that the country which focuses on the democratic reforms, on anti-corruption reforms, they can survive without even having good relations with Russia, because that was actually the message of Russians for many years, that you can survive only by being close to us. But then we said, no, we have our own path, we want to change this country, and this is the will of the people, this is the will of the government, and we did this. So at this moment, apparently, we have managed to maintain the fact that we don't have the petty corruption. But at the same time, we still face challenges when it comes to the grand corruption. And definitely I can say that because we still did not focus enough to build the, or this time that we had, was not enough to build the really, really strong institutions. So that was, and the checks and balances system, this is the main thing here, because without having the proper checks and balances system, you might not have the petty corruption, but you will have the grand corruption, and this will be the main challenge for the country. So what we have now, we have problems with the grand corruption. We apparently facing how the state is captured in this country. And this is the reality, and more we see that it's happening. And this is unfortunate reality, I should say. So, yeah, we don't have the proper checks and balances system in Georgia. The ruling party does everything to maintain in power. We have the elections, but during the elections, the ruling party abuses the state administrative resources. We see the sign of kleptocracy here as well, because all the groups which can resist to the corruption and to the kleptocracy, actually, they are very weak. And apparently the government uses this kind of technique to divide and rule. This is what is happening here, that the groups, the civil society, the opposition parties, the institutions are very weak, so our system cannot resist to kleptocracy and to the grand corruption threats in this country. We see also that, again, the civil society is under the attack, especially the watchdog organizations, those who speak about the problems in this country. We see that the opposition is under the many opposition leaders are under the investigation, and again, because the system is abused, because the law enforcement agencies are abused, and apparently we still speak about the politically motivated investigations in this country. We have the clanning judiciary, which again is backed by the ruling party, which actually again helps the ruling party to punish those who are resisting to the corruption, who are fighting against the corruption and the abuse of power. And definitely we looked at, we see that the critical media is under the attack. And now apparently we are in the situation when the director of one critical media outlet is in the prison for really nothing. So this is the reality that we see. We are not happy about this apparently, because we all talked about this window of opportunity that Ukraine gave us, that because of the war in Ukraine, now Georgians also have the chance to be closer to EU, to really become the member of the EU, but because of this situation that we have here, because the state is captured, because everything that happens here is in the hands, mostly in the hands of the ruling party, we have the concerns that we might not get there. So yeah, so this is again the unfortunate reality that we see. So and we have many discussions in this country. Where is the solution? Definitely, solution rests with the people. Definitely, people who once said that we don't want the corruption here. We don't want to, like, you know, for the particular groups to abuse the power. We don't want to, like, you know, for the regular people to suffer from the corruption. So we achieved that. We showed to the whole world that we can achieve this. But now, again, we need for people to understand how important it is to resist to the corrupt regimes, to resist to the kleptocracy in this country, and to resist to the state capture in this country.
Thank you, Eka. Ben, do you have anything to say about all this?
Well, I just wanted to say it's always going to be hard to follow such strong and eloquent voices from the region and from the academy, and it's a real honor to be on this panel. But I wanted to begin my remarks by talking also a little bit about the work of the Moderator, which is when Charles began and pioneered this crusade against kleptocracy in Washington. Paul Manafort was at large on K Street. Some of the worst oligarchs now under the sanctions lists were being courted and feted in Kalorama, and it's important to acknowledge that we have come a long way since then. You know, if we look at where we are now, there has been progress. There's an anti-kleptocracy strategy. There's an anti-kleptocracy caucus in the House. There are major sanctions placed on these kleptocratic figures that have been sort of menacing the West. But we shouldn't confuse this progress, some progress, or even significant progress, for sufficient progress. We have laid foundations. We have not built a wall against this threat. We've come to acknowledge it, but we still aren't taking it seriously. So what are the three ways that we in Washington, in Brussels, in London are not taking it seriously? There are 3 points I wanted to go for. The first is we are trying to do this on the cheap. We do not have the staff allocated to this. We do not have, therefore, the capacity to go after these problems. If you don't have the staff, you don't have the information. If you don't have the information, you don't have the prosecutions. We simply cannot, when it comes to this problem, attempt to solve a complicated problem, a really threatening one of 2022 with a staffing level of 1995. And just to put it in more stark terms, there are more people dealing with litter in Crown Heights in New York than there are dealing with this hugely dangerous problem that we face. And the second problem we face is we're not doing it in a joined-up way. The UK, the EU, and the United States simply have not managed to coordinate their anti-kleptocracy policies in order a way to close those gaps that Putin and his cronies can get through. There are regulatory asymmetries. Some laws in the UK, some laws in the US, some laws in the EU, they don't all join up. They offer ways for kleptocrats to get through. There are gaps within the EU. The EU does not have a functioning single anti-money laundering agency. There are huge disparities of responsibility, of where problems are supposed to be solved, and these are all offering gaps for kleptocrats to go through. And there hasn't been an effort to really try and create a central anti-corruption body to address some of the legal problems that exist currently. Right now, there are legal obstacles that make it very hard for an investigator in Florida to get information from an investigator in London to solve a case that might be here in Georgia. It's simply been viewed as not a priority or too hard to try and deal with these kind of problems. So this brings us to the third point, and this is what I really want us to kind of take home here, which is the danger of the danger of a hologram anti-kleptocracy front. So the worst hologram anti-kleptocracy effort is probably the United Kingdom. In my country, you can see, if you open the books, the laws are there. If you look at the government statements, the statements are there. If you look at the teams, well, the teams exist, but because none of them are staffed, none of them have capacity, and none of them can therefore achieve any prosecutions, it's a hologram. It looks like it's real, but then when you get close, you can put your hand through it. And as long as you can put your hand through it, Putin and his corrupt forces can go right through that. So I want to kind of end with, I think, the key point in which all of these kind of voices from the region and from the academy, and of course Charles has been saying for so long, which is anti-kleptocracy is geopolitics. It is very hard to capture for authoritarians the spirit and the mind of a society. And as we see in Georgia, it's a society that's continued to move away from Putin's vision of the world. But it is, unfortunately, very easy to capture oligarchs. What defends you in that situation? It's strong institutions. And you get strong institutions through strong anti-kleptocracy. And that's why anti-kleptocracy is geopolitics, and a geopolitics that's crucial to tie together all of the themes we've been discussing at this wonderful and important conference.
Well, thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
So, including and going beyond what Ben has just said, could we get Eka's perspective and then Marta's also on what your organizations and you think about what we can do to counter and vastly curtail the problem of corruption and kleptocracy in your countries? And of course, this isn't something confined on the national level, but if you could comment on that, because I know both of your organizations have a view of this, and what are the priorities, and how do you see the role of the West in terms of what you confront in your countries? Shall we start with Eka?
So I'll start with Georgia. So I think that for Georgians, it's very important now for the donors to coordinate their activities, or international community to coordinate their activities to really back and assist those who are resisting to the corruption. And this is definitely the civil society. We have very active civil society here. They try their best, they investigate, they are vocal, they try to inform people about the corruption risks and why it's important to end some particular cases of corruption. And definitely these are, as I said, these are organizations which are under and the individuals who are under the attack. So I think that we really need the visual, also the physical support, and also the financial support in order to make the work of this organization stronger. So then, of course, the investigative media especially, and the media as a whole, the Georgian media needs the support. And we all understand that sometimes the media has problems with the quality. We understand that our media also needs the time to develop and to be on the high level. But anyways, these are the groups who are really resisting to kleptocracy and corruption in this country. Definitely, we need the proper analysis of the situation here, because sometimes we feel that even our friends, they don't really understand what's going on the ground. And it's very important to know why something's happening here. Because again, the kleptocrats are very, very smart. And they know how even to package their policies and their strategies, and how make sure that our Western partners think that these initiatives are okay and good. But then it's very important to know right from the beginning what are the intentions of those who want to maintain in power forever. And so that's why I think that the right policies towards these people and the ruling party in our case, and the right assessment of the situation will help. So as for the international level, so I would talk about the views also of Transparency International. I think that one thing is the cooperation and coordination. This is what we talked about now, and this is what is very important, because we don't see this kind of one-line policy. We don't see that. I think that we need the global cooperation, the data exchange, the investigative bodies cooperation, and all this. This is very important. Second, the policy should be introduced very fast, because the kleptocrats, they don't have this, like, bureaucratic systems, and they can introduce and adopt any policies and strategies in, like, 1 day time. And we don't have time, because the corruption becomes very complex and like every day. So we need the fast strategies, fast decisions.
Right.
This is what we need.
And as we know, they're advised by the best in the West, which helps too.
Yeah.
Can we move on to Ukraine, and then we can always
Can
come
I
back?
actually add a few points before we move to Ukraine about Georgia? Because I've learned all excellent points. Like, I agree wholeheartedly. I've learned this week that the Georgian parliament is discussing the new bill about possibly electing the prosecutor general in Georgia.
Yes.
And immediately, obviously, it caught my attention, which seems like a great idea, especially if it serves to bring the opposition and the governing party together around the negotiation table. But we also need to be quite realistic, especially when it comes to fighting the kleptocracy. That it's a one piece of a bigger puzzle. And just in itself, just electing the prosecutor like it happens in the United States. By the way, in the US, we have more than 2,300 local prosecutors elected every 4 years. So it's a political position. There is some independence associated with it, but there are tons of other challenges. If we have the time, we can talk about this at some point. Yeah. So it's a big puzzle, and I want to make sure that the civil society is at the table, not only outside talking about this issue, but if we want to reform the prosecutorial system, I think that countries like Georgia, Ukraine, others should consider forming a formal civil society governing board which oversees prosecutorial decision-making. So the board can get together every month. We have precedents of this in the United States and other countries. We can learn from those experiences, review data, review statistics, pull certain cases, and if they think that some cases are politically motivated, they should have the veto power. The civil society should have that power, not only being outside and talking about this when no one is listening, but have the formal responsibility to oversee prosecutorial decision-making. Can I make one other quick point?
Very quickly, maybe, because we're going to come back to this after.
Okay, so
well, why don't you save that point for when we come back to judicial reform?
I want to talk about the solutions.
No, what?
I
Oh
want to
yeah.
talk about the solutions.
Well, no, without, we've gotten to the solutions in our agenda already. Don't worry. And judicial reform is a huge issue in Ukraine, of course, and is talked about a lot. As we know, and we'll get to that. And Marta has wanted to address that too. So we'll get there in just a few minutes. But first, let's hear Marta on going back to what can we do about corruption and kleptocracy, and from your perspective, Ukraine, the work of ANTAC, what are the priorities? What do you see as the key things that can be done to vastly curtail this problem? What are the realistic priorities, not the dreams, of course, and you can refer to some of the things Ben mentioned if you want to.
Yeah, actually, I agree, and thanks to Benjamin on systematizing existing problems, which I totally agree. And unfortunately, sanctions mechanism and looking for those people, they revealed a lot of problems actually in existing legislation, and it also pushed, for example, even EU for much faster legislative process and so on. And I agree that cooperation, data sharing is really what we see is lacking now in imposing effective sanctions mechanisms. Another big issue, and this is also a big political issue, but crucial for fighting for Ukraine actually, and for fighting for Ukrainian victory and Russian corruption is designating Russia as state sponsor of terrorism. This will lead to a lot of actually things which will help us to fight this corrupted money in different actually spheres, and will not let to influence both like military and international politics and to launder this money. So this is actually what West can do and what the West should do. Apart from all this systemic, more comprehensive work on anti-money laundering, which actually Ben said. And
in terms, should we move to judicial reform, because judicial reform has been a huge issue in Ukraine right now, and I know Antac's been involved with that. So, what can you tell us about the current situation of the judiciary in terms of corruption, kleptocracy, and where are you advocating for things to go?
Yeah, and I also wanted to share this experience also with Georgia, because Georgia for us was an example years before in fighting corruption, and we were very inspired by Georgian experience. And what can we share from our experience actually in terms of fighting corruption, in that you have to build a system. One element is not enough. For example, we had situations where we had a lot of transparency, good investigative journalism who revealed a lot of corruption. But, for example, without prosecution, without investigation and judicial system, you cannot do anything. And if one of this part of this puzzle is missing, corruption will prevail and you cannot fight it. So actually, a Ukrainian example, and I cannot pretend it's like universal, but we created parallel system of those bodies because we could not reform like a really huge system of police, prosecution and judicial system. But we understand that without reforming like the whole judiciary, not only creating anti-corruption court, you cannot like establish rule of law in the country. So in Ukraine, one of our like innovations was engaging international experts, like people with very high integrity. We engaged them to selecting high anti-corruption court judges, and it worked out. Actually, it worked out very good, though it's hard to find those people, to engage them, to explain them the context, so also they understand what are the risks and what is truth in this situation. And but apart from this recipe is working quite good, and we use it for cleansing our High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission. Just before the start of the war, like these bodies were to start working. It was like stalled for a few months, but now we are renewing this process actually, and we hope we will win in all senses.
As do we. Besiki, when you hear this, how do you assess the situation in Ukraine, and what can they do better?
Well, you're saying you are inspired by Georgians. We're definitely inspired by the Ukrainians. The whole world is. So, thank you. I'm not an expert in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have developed a specialized prosecutorial office to deal with corruption cases. We have models like that in the United States. I'm not sure that's fairly effective. But when you do not have the time to reform the bigger system, judiciary, existing prokuratura, Soviet prokuratura that is still ingrained into our blood so much, there is an option of creating that. I certainly think that that's not the way that we should be thinking about right now. I think we should think about reforming the entire prosecutorial system, because you cannot reform the judiciary without reforming the prosecutorial system. And another aspect, in addition to engaging much more formally the civil society, we need to think about a dedicated task force that focuses on the kleptocracy cases. And the task force does need to have the partnerships you were mentioning, Ben. We need to have the international partnerships, because countries like Georgia or Russia don't even have the capacity, like you were saying, to have those groups together. We need experts on money laundering, foreign evidence gathering, asset forfeiture, prosecution, investigation with data specialists. This is a serious investment that the countries have to make if they're serious about tackling kleptocracy. And the West cannot leave places like Georgia, Ukraine, whatever, alone tackling this humongous problem. Let's not forget that the West has contributed to this problem or enabled this problem. We know when the bankers, some of your friends in London and Wall Street have created those offshore accounts where all the money could have been shipped and managed remotely for those mafiosos or kleptocrats or tax evaders. Maybe intention was not there, but that has enabled the kleptocracy to flourish in places like Eastern Europe. So the West certainly has the responsibility, moral, financial, and otherwise, and has to provide resources to change this. And that can also imply creating additional laws, regulations to eliminate safe havens for kleptocrats to ship money, manage remotely, and just enjoy good lives and send their children to colleges in London and New York.
Fantastic, Besiki. Thank you. I think we need to go to the floor soon, if I'm right, looking at the time. So I'd like Ben to make a few comments before we do that in a minute. Ben, can you, without speaking quickly, because remember, we can't speak too fast because of the simultaneous translation.
Thank you. I think it's very important now to think, how can we link all of this thinking about anti-kleptocracy to actual pieces of politics happening now that will help Ukraine win the war, sustain European support, and move it towards its goal, which is membership of the EU. And two ideas that we can go into more detail later, I think, are important. One is to create a Ukraine-EU reconstruction agency with European officials, and British and American, I would hope too, on the board that administers contracts where the aid goes in Ukraine. And that can demonstrate that you don't need to be worried about sustaining and increasing the money to Ukraine over the long term, and shut down critics that are voicing concerns about where certain things are going. And the second, and I might not be popular saying this, is to engage with Emmanuel Macron's idea of the European political community. It's being launched and discussed in Prague at the next European Council, and it offers another option for conditionality that can accelerate reforms. And we know that Ukraine has sprinted for reforms to get candidate status. This is an opportunity to sprint for more reforms. And I think that we can try and see if we can include an anti-corruption element in his proposal.
Wonderful. Well, as we go to the floor, I'd just like to mention one thing in complimenting what Eka said, and Besiki and Marta too, which is there is a very serious effort underway to create an international anti-corruption court. I don't know how many of you have heard about this. It's being headed up by Mark Wolf, who is a federal judge in Boston, and they've got an organization, and it's all sorts of prominent people are pushing for this, sort of modeled on the ICC, and it's Union Transparency International.
We appreciate this. For sure, we're advocating.
Yeah. A lot of people are increasingly thinking that this thing isn't completely crazy. Lo and behold. So, are there any questions? If there aren't, we can, of course, continue to wind. Oh, I see a French accent in the second row, if we have a microphone. And I see another French accent in the fourth row. Okay.
Thank you, Charles. I had a question for Ben.
Who are you?
I'm Laure Mendeville from the Figaro. So I had a question for Ben. I was wondering whether, the long legs and long arms of Putin's kleptocracy in Londongrad had been just frozen or partly destroyed, and in which state is this, the situation legally and financially of the riches of, Russian oligarchy, Putinist oligarchy in your country? Thank you.
The answer is partially destroyed, but you need to remember that there's not just the Putin kleptocracy that's been working through London and using it to enrich and undermine its own societies. There are important coteries of kleptocrats from Africa, South Asia, and most importantly in London, the Middle East, which have been using the city as a base to launder their society's wealth, undermining their own societies, which makes them a security threat to the West. So it's really important that we try and go after the system and not just the Russians if we don't want to open up future dangers here.
Can I add on this? So
please.
also, you know, we speak about the banks and bankers and lobbyists and real estate agents and all these people who help kleptocrats to navigate the Western systems, right? But it's not enough. I mean, we should really think about the policies and how to punish these groups because they are helping these kleptocrats to live a nice life in the Western countries and to enjoy the life, and they want the corrupt countries for their citizens, but not for themselves. You know, their families are outside and they feel very well there. So that's why I think that we should really think about the proper policies, how to target these groups as well.
Right. French accent number 2, and then I see some non-French accents.
Sorry,
back
but
there.
I think we have a concern. I'm Nicolas Tenza. We have a concern with corruption, I think. Just a follow-up, I mean, just a question, remarks that I put already yesterday. You know, we have in Europe, in France, but also in Germany, Italy, and many other countries, we have, I mean, basically the spread of Russian, I mean, pro-Russian peoples, pro-Russian nationals. Just fueling, I mean, the Kremlin's narrative, endorsing this narrative. We see many of them in the TV shows, in the newspapers, etc. So there is a very strong suspicions of corruptions from, I mean, sometimes former member of the government, former member of the parliament, sometimes journalists. We really suspect that many of them may have received some bribes from the Kremlin, but also from China, Azerbaijan, because it's not only limited to Russia. So 2 questions. First questions, who could we, I mean, basically step in our fight against domestic corruptions by foreign powers? I think it's absolutely crucial, not often tackled. Then there is a second point, which is that in many countries, including mine, this kind of corruptions is sometimes legal. It's sometimes legal. I mean, we know also in Germany the case of Gerhard Schröder, etc., other cases, of course. It's not illegal to work and to lobby for a foreign government. So what should be the efforts done to make them illegal? I think that's absolutely a crucial point, and I would like to hear, I mean, the members of the panel about
Great.
that.
Okay, so I think that's terrific, and we'll address that. I would just make a preliminary comment. I guess I'm not really supposed to do this as moderator, but I think in this context, one thing to keep in mind is that people who have dedicated their careers to government often come out without much money. You know, they don't have yachts and whatnot. And so it's not very expensive to buy people if they're in that situation and they're willing to sell themselves. So I think this is, we're not necessarily talking about large sums of money. We're talking often about small sums of money being very cleverly targeted and husbanded along, shall we say. So that one you have to admit. This is a big question. Who would like to start responding to Nicolas? Oh, and I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. Nicolas Tenzer just spoke, and he is a leading French political analyst and very, very well known in France. So what What reactions do we have to Nicola's point? Do you want to
I'm
kick
ready
in,
if,
Ben, and then then we need to get Ukraine also, yeah?
You go first.
Okay.
Oh,
so,
all right, okay, you can preempt.
I mean, it's very interesting question. So apparently, it takes you to this definition of corruption as well, right? So, like, what's the corruption? Is the the bribery? It's the state capture. It's like grand corruption, kleptocracy, and strategic corruption, right? So like, when it is used, the corruption is used as a geopolitical weapon to undermine the sovereign state, right? So, and in this, definitely, you need different actors. And definitely these actors, again, helps you as a country which uses the strategic corruption tools to navigate in the system and to reach your goal, right? So I think that we, again, every day, we see that the new forms of corruption arise, and we have to deal with this. And again, we should be very fast in our decisions and introducing the policies towards this. And we should find a way how to challenge these groups as well, which maybe act legally on the ground, but in a bigger picture, how are the tools in the strategic corruption?
Yeah, let's do it. Marta or Besiki, anything before Ben
Just
gets
literally two sentences about this. I mean, corruption is a law enforcement. It's political, but it's also the law enforcement problem. Prosecutors are dedicating 95% of their resources dealing with low-level crimes and reacting to things as opposed to investing into proactive, investigative capacity building. So those cases, I will never gonna be seeing the, outside the certain pockets, because there is no one in the offices to spend years, sometimes even longer, to pursue those cases, because that requires a lot of resources and you need top prosecutors and investigators and international partnerships and the political will within the countries to go after those cases. So unfortunately, if one of the ingredient is not there, and in our case many ingredients are not there, we're not going to be successful.
Right. Well, and then the point, the issue Nicola brought up, we don't even have the laws yet in some cases. We have to figure out how
we have enough
to deal
law.
with
I think we have
legally.
enough laws to justify investigating corruption cases, white-collar cases. I think there are enough laws if there is a capacity and the will to go after those individuals.
And
I don't think this is
systemic
the
approach, I
legislative
would
problem. I think it's an enforcement and a political problem.
Yeah. Marta, anything on this?
Yeah, I just also, I think it's an important question, and it's an issue which is now very relevant because Russia has a lot of resources and it's like influencing a lot of decisions by different ways, and they are inventive with financial things. And there are like 3 points which I can think of now. First is, as Eka said, like some inventing and thinking about some legal policies. Secondly, it's like really effective anti-money laundering and transparency of financial flows. Because when you see those flows and you can reveal it and you communicate it, it's totally different situation. When you understand where you can block money and you can show where money goes and to which source. And third one is a political responsibility too, that societies have to not accept it. Actually, it has to be unacceptable also on the societal level that some politicians are not like even ex-politicians, for whom it's like legal to be like somewhere in state companies, that it's unacceptable, and they have to understand that this policy is influenced by these politicians, and they have to voice their disagree with these decisions.
Great.
Thank you.
Very quickly, Ben, because then we want to have time to take a couple more questions.
Well, in the last panel, we heard that famous slogan, which is really a concept for our freedom and yours, the idea that the freedom of people in Europe and in repressed European societies is bound up ultimately with the freedom of the Russian people. And I'd like to add another concept, which is our corruption and yours, which is that the corruption of the Kremlin system is bound up with our own corruption. And the way that a lot of this money has found its target is through techniques, through a whole offshore finance world that was developed by our bankers and lawyers and accountants to hide the money of our elites. So many of these people have been bought in Europe through all kinds of loopholes and techniques that allow our own domestic sources of corruption and influence to buy politicians. So we need to try and dismantle both at the same time if we're going to have any hope going forward, like with our hopes of freedom.
Indeed. We have a couple of questions. I see on the left, a number of rows there, one, please. And if you can just identify yourself and...
Sure, thank you. My name is Sarah Clark, and I'm the head of Article 19 Europe. We work a lot on the issue of SLAPs, so strategic litigation against journalists and other corruption watchdogs. There's been a lot of focus on this in the UK because of those vexatious lawsuits that are taken by largely UK law firms against journalists investigating oligarchs, both from Russia and elsewhere. I wanted to ask the panel whether the issue of strategic lawsuits has come up in Georgia and Ukraine. Are you facing these types of suits, or are you being sued transnationally in London? And I also wanted to sort of reach out to the rest of the audience here that we've put through measures at the EU that are in draft form that would prevent the taking of SLAPs. And we've done this also in the UK. However, we're seeing a lot of governments, including the French government, who aren't supporting these measures. So we really need to see a lot more support from the UK, from France, from Germany, and from other governments who might be in the room. Please support the anti-SLAP measures that we're trying to get through to protect watchdogs like those on the panel. Thank you.
Right. Well, the issue of anti-SLAP isn't really the subject of this panel, but I think we're all very plugged into it. If anybody want a quick comment, we have to end here, actually. Oh, we'll take one more question.
I'll make one question about the reporters and the journalists, if I may.
The SLAP? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. Just before you mention that, Besiki, I'd just like to say there's a big effort in the United States to pass federal anti-SLAP legislation, and actually the Free Russia Foundation is involved in that effort, and it's quite far advanced. There's a bill that is under consideration and going through our sausage factory legislative process right now. So we have something going on there. I don't know if it were the UK, Ben would comment, etc. But Besiki, very quickly on that, and then we'll take a last question.
No, I want to mention, just piggyback on that, as an American, Georgian American, watching what's happening in the country through the lens of the Georgian reporters, I want to really take this moment and thank them, because they are not very much loved always, and they're doing the hardest job in the country at the expense of their lives, their mental and physical health, and whether we like the reporting or not, sometimes they are the ones who are keeping the democracy alive in this country, and we need to find the ways how to support independent reporting as much as possible.
Thank you.
Last question on the right. Lady with dark hair back there. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yesterday we had some curious...
Can you identify yourself,
Katie
please?
Kutateladze, Open Society Georgia Foundation. Yesterday we heard some curious news that a group sponsored by Ukrainian Anticorruption Agency has called for sanctions on Bidzina Ivanishvili and about 11 persons pretty close to him, mostly relatives, because of having direct communication and co-work, as I guess, with Russian oligarchs. It's interesting for me, you as experts in this field, how do you see it? As just a call, or do you see that it will have a serious follow-up like a real investigation and potential sanctions, like something like has happened to Plachatniuk in Moldova. Thank you.
Well, would anybody like to touch? Would anybody like to touch that? Maybe.
I think Katie knows my answer, but it was to the international experts, maybe. But okay, but I think that generally for our ruler, the real ruler of this country, of course, it's problematic, I would say. And I mean, he was not, he's not only in this list, but the European Parliament mentioned him, like, you know, saying that, talked about the possibility of his sanctioning, and definitely he faces problems with his money in the Swiss bank. So I think, yes, from the reputation point of view in general, it's a problematic for him. Apparently, if I would be in his shoes, I would think, like, you know, what I did wrong. So that's my answer.
Well, for the moment, I don't see that actually politically happening on the cards, but I do hear a rising conversation and rising questioning about it, and it's going to be very interesting to hear where that goes, tied in, of course, to how things develop here.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to us.
Thank you very much.